Shields up! All crew to their stations, Captain Talon Yarris barked, his voice cutting through the cramped corridors of the Resolute like a whip. The sound of boots pounding against the metallic floor reverberated in the air as crew members scrambled to their posts. The ship shuddered violently, a stark reminder that they were no longer in the safety of deep space. Yarris's hands gripped the armrests of his captain's chair as the Resolute lurched again, its hull groaning under the strain of the ionized atmosphere around the planet Ithra. His brow furrowed, eyes narrowing as the ship's sensors flared to life, flashing multiple alerts in his heads-up display. The red warnings were like a fevered pulse, each one an accusation that things weren't going as planned. "Report!" he demanded, his tone sharp, slicing through the tension in the bridge. "Contact with Ithran ships at 30,000 kilometers, Captain," Lieutenant Commander Tyron Vark called from his station, his eyes scanning multiple readouts on the laser plasma display before him. "They're keeping their distance, no signs of overt hostility, yet." Yarris didn't relax. He'd been on enough diplomatic missions to know that tension could linger just beneath the surface, especially when there was something to hide. Ithra was on the edge of collapse, and they had no idea if it was a disease or something darker that had driven the planet to this point. The mission had already gone sideways. He turned to the comms officer, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "Open a secure line to Ithra's government. It's time we had a conversation." Minutes passed, dragging on like hours, the Resolute weaving through waves of ion storms as it approached the planet's orbit. The bridge vibrated slightly with the energy of their entry into Ithra's atmosphere. Each blast of turbulence felt through the very core of the ship. It wasn't the usual kind of stress. It was something heavier, something off. Then came the voice from Ithra's capital, a smooth but cold transmission. "Captain Yarris, we were expecting you." A chill ran down his spine as he adjusted his stance in his seat. There was a certain cadence to the Ithran leader's tone, one that hinted at an underlying agenda. "Minister Drathar Nul, we're here to assist," Yarris said, leaning forward slightly. "I trust that your people are prepared for our medical assistance." Silence filled the comms for a heartbeat before Drathar's voice returned, sharp as a blade. "Prepared, yes, but not just for medicine. There are other matters that require attention." The way he emphasized "other" made Yarris's skin crawl. His instincts were screaming this was no ordinary mission. As the transmission ended, Vark, ever the skeptical strategist, shot Yarris a look. "I don't trust that guy. There's something about him, something in the way he speaks." Yarris nodded, staring at the view screen. The planet Ithra sprawled out below them, a faded jewel of blues and greens amidst swirling clouds of brown. At first glance, it looked like any other planet ravaged by disease, its cities battered, the air thick with the remnants of desperation. But the deep-set shadow over Ithra's surface, those impenetrable dark clouds, wasn't just from the disease. It was the looming weight of something far more sinister, something the crew hadn't been told yet. And he had a sinking feeling they'd be walking into a trap. "Prepare for docking," Yarris ordered, the tension in his voice unmistakable. The sound of the docking clamps echoed through the corridors as the Resolute slid smoothly into place at Ithra's main medical station, a sprawling complex built deep within the planet's urban center. The station was a lifeline for the planet's remaining population, a population slowly being eaten away by a disease that had baffled even their most advanced scientific minds. Yarris had to admit, the sight of it made his chest tighten. "Let's make this fast," he muttered to Vark, as the airlock doors opened with a pneumatic hiss. The cold metal of the station greeted them like an old, familiar enemy. The hallways were sterile, clinically clean, but the walls seemed to close in with an oppressive weight. The overhead lights flickered as though they were about to fail, casting long shadows across the floor that stretched like fingers creeping toward the newcomers. Yarris led the team, moving quickly down the hallway with Vark and Dr. Kayvon Tresh, the chief medical officer, at his side. The familiar scent of antiseptic and disinfectant filled the air, clinging to the back of Yarris's throat as they proceeded. His eyes flicked to the walls, searching for any sign of the disease they'd come to treat, but it was clear. No one was eager to make eye contact. "They know something we don't," Vark muttered under his breath, glancing around suspiciously. "This place feels like a trap waiting to spring." Dr. Tresh was already scanning the terminal displays, where the medical data streamed in at an overwhelming pace. "This is bad, Captain. Worse than we thought. It's not just the virus. They're hiding something. Look here." Tresh gestured to the display. "The infection spread is abnormal. It doesn't make sense." Yarris stepped forward, eyes narrowing as he read the data. "What do you mean? Is it airborne? Can we cure it?" The virus is mutating too rapidly. It's almost engineered. But I've never seen anything like it," Tresh said, his voice heavy with the weight of his frustration. "We're going to need to dig deeper. Something is controlling its spread." The room was cold, but it wasn't just the chill of the air. It was the creeping realization that there was more at stake here than anyone had anticipated. A sharp bang echoed down the hall, followed by the unmistakable sound of bootsteps. Ithran soldiers, their faces set in grim determination, appeared at the end of the corridor. General Riker Allen, leading the squad, stopped abruptly as he locked eyes with Yarris. "I hope your ship is as prepared as your men," Allen said, his words laced with hidden meaning. Yarris's hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his sidearm. "We're here to save lives, but we won't stand down if you try to stop us." The tension was palpable, thick like smoke in the air. For a moment there was nothing but silence, a standoff where both sides knew what was at stake. A galactic power was on the brink of war, and Earth was now caught in the middle of it. "Don't make us your enemy," Yarris said quietly, his voice resolute. As the soldiers filed in, tension crackling between them like static, Yarris felt a cold knot form in his gut. This wasn't just a mission to heal a dying planet. It was the beginning of something much darker, and in that silence, he knew. They were no longer just medical diplomats. They were at war. The door slid open with a pneumatic hiss, the faint sound of it mixing with the low murmur of the Ithran medical facility's undercurrent of quiet, sterile activity. The heavy scent of disinfectant lingered, sharp and intrusive in Yarris's nostrils. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything about this mission, this planet, was contaminated in more ways than just the disease. The soldiers under General Riker Allen's command flanked them silently, their eyes scanning every corner of the corridor. Allen, a towering figure, his face set like stone, moved with the grace of someone used to navigating treacherous waters. "You'll find the treatment rooms down the hall, Captain," he said, not quite making eye contact. "But first, I recommend you check in with Minister Null. He insists on being present for every step of your intervention." "Noted," Yarris replied, his tone steady but sharp. He didn't like this. There was too much control, too much unnecessary interference. It was a feeling he'd learned to trust in the many years of diplomatic missions. But this one felt heavier, like walking into the belly of a beast without knowing its teeth. He shot a glance at Vark, who, though silent, carried an expression that mirrored his thoughts. Something was wrong here. The air itself seemed tainted with suspicion. Yarris led his team further down the sterile halls, the click of boots on the polished floor the only sound. Dr. Kayvon Tresh was already murmuring under his breath, his mind working through the logistics of the cure they were about to administer. But even he, with his decades of experience, looked disturbed by the coldness that enveloped them. "Not all the patients are showing the same symptoms," Tresh muttered. His eyes flicked to the laser plasma display embedded in the wall, where real-time data on the disease's spread flashed across the screen in a rapid blur of red. "There's something off about it. It's evolving too quickly." "That's not all," Vark said, glancing over his shoulder. "Did you notice the soldiers? Their body language. They're not afraid. They're anticipating." Yarris nodded. "I don't like it either." He turned his gaze forward, but the unease gnawed at him, crawling under his skin. He couldn't pin down what it was, but everything about Ithra screamed deceit. At the end of the hall, Minister Null awaited them in a sterile white chamber, his hands folded behind his back. His face, calm and calculating, betrayed nothing of what lay behind those eyes. "Captain Yarris," Null said smoothly, his voice almost too smooth. "It is a rare honor for Ithra to receive such assistance. I hope your team is well prepared." Yarris didn't answer immediately. He studied the minister. The way his posture was almost too perfect, too controlled. There was a sense of detachment about him, a sort of isolation that made him seem both foreign and unnervingly familiar. "We've come to do what we can," Yarris said, his eyes narrowing. "Let's begin with the treatment. We'll need full access to your facilities." Newell gave a slight nod. "Of course. You may proceed." But his eyes never left Yarris's face, and it was then that the captain noticed it. The faintest flicker of a smirk playing at the corner of Newell's lips, barely there but enough to send a chill up his spine. Inside the treatment room, the first signs of trouble were subtle, almost invisible, but unmistakable to someone trained to read the room. Tresh immediately set to work, but his quick hands faltered as he ran his fingers over the medical data displayed in front of him. The virus, as he had suspected, was mutating at an alarming rate. The cells weren't just sickening the body, they were changing it. "What's happening here?" Tresh muttered almost to himself. "This is no natural disease." Vark, ever the vigilant one, was already moving through the room, eyes darting, observing the medical staff's behavior. It was odd how they moved around the patients without seeming truly engaged. Their expressions were flat, almost mechanical. His hand moved to the hilt of his weapon instinctively, but he knew better than to draw attention. "I'm not getting the readings I expected," Tresh continued, his voice tight with frustration. He turned to Yarris. "Captain, this isn't just a disease. It's engineered, deliberately so. Someone is controlling the spread." Yarris's stomach twisted. Controlled? By whom? But before Tresh could answer, a sharp crackle from the laser plasma display interrupted them. The screen flickered, then stabilized, showing an unfamiliar set of coordinates, a series of numbers encrypted with an access level high enough to make even the Resolute security protocols tremble. Someone was tapping into the ship's systems. "Encryption breach," Vark said, his eyes narrowing as he moved closer to the display. "It's not just a medical issue. They're tracking our every move." "Damn it," Yarris muttered, slamming his fist into the side of a nearby console. "We're not just fighting a disease here, we're walking into a war." The tension in the air thickened, and Yarris had no intention of staying in the dark for long. He called in his senior officers, including Drex and Vark, and laid out the information as quickly as he could. "The disease is artificially designed, and we're being watched," Yarris said, his voice low but sharp. "The Ithran government isn't just trying to stop the disease. They're hiding something from us. The virus is a decoy, a means to control their population, and someone wants us to get caught in their game." "We can't be sure of that yet," Vark warned. "But if that message from the minister is any indication, we're about to be knee-deep in something much bigger than we thought." Tresh was already typing furiously into the system, trying to uncover the source of the encryption breach. "There's a level of access here that doesn't belong to anyone in this facility. It's military grade. Someone's feeding us false information." Yarris's jaw tightened. "And the damn virus was only the beginning. We're being manipulated. Every step we've taken was part of their plan." A subtle vibration beneath their feet shook the room, a low rumble that felt far too intentional to be a coincidence. Yarris raised his head, eyes narrowing as the tension grew unbearable. Then came the voice, a sudden and cold presence that filled the room, reverberating from all directions. The voice of General Riker Allen, unmistakable and laced with thinly veiled menace. "The captain is right, you know," Allen's voice echoed. "You are part of something much larger than you realize. I hope you're ready for what's coming next." Yarris's hand instinctively moved toward his sidearm, but the voice continued, flooding the room with an icy certainty. "You see, Captain, the disease is not our greatest weapon. It is simply the means to an end. Welcome to the real Ithra." The display flickered again, this time showing the unmistakable outline of a massive structure, an underground facility that even the crew hadn't been briefed on. The scope of it was terrifying, an entire army hidden beneath the surface of the planet, and something far worse. An AI, a mind capable of controlling the masses, was the true force behind Ithra's suffering. As Yarris processed the enormity of the situation, A single thought reverberated in his mind. This wasn't just a mission. This was a fight for the future of the galaxy. The next move had to be perfect, or the war would begin before they even realized it had already started. The air in the medical bay felt thick with the weight of unspoken truths. The soft buzz of the laser plasma display was the only noise that dared break the silence as Yarris watched the data scroll across the screen, each number more damning than the last. Tresh had been right. The disease wasn't a natural virus. It was something far more sinister, engineered with precision and intent. But what it was meant to achieve still eluded them. "Captain, this doesn't make sense," Tresh muttered, leaning closer to the screen. His fingers hovered over the controls, as though trying to unlock a hidden message within the flood of data. "This isn't just a disease, it's a weapon. Whoever created this, they were testing its capabilities. The rapid mutations, the targeted breakdown of immune systems, it's all too calculated." Yarris frowned, his brow furrowing as he stepped closer to the display. The symbols were alien, not just in language but in structure. The virus had been designed to evolve in response to different environmental stimuli, but there was something deeper, a darker purpose lurking behind it. "We're not dealing with a disease, Kayvon," Yarris said, his voice low. "This is control. They're testing something more dangerous than a virus. Whoever made this, they wanted to see how the population would respond, how they could manipulate it." But who? The question gnawed at him. The answer was just out of reach, like a shadow on the edge of his vision, elusive yet all-encompassing. Vark, who had been silent up until now, spoke in his usual blunt tone. "This doesn't feel like a plan to contain the disease. They're using it to control the population. That's the real weapon here." "Control," Yarris repeated. "But how?" The door to the medical bay slid open without warning, the heavy footfalls of General Riker Aylin filling the space before he even spoke. His face was a mask of impassivity, but the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth betrayed a sense of urgency, something Yarris couldn't ignore. Aylin's presence felt like a weight pressing down on the room. "Captain," Allen began, his voice cutting through the tension, "I see you've uncovered part of the puzzle, but you're only scratching the surface." Yarris didn't bother with pleasantries. "What are you hiding, General?" Allen's gaze flickered to Tresh, then back to Yarris, as if weighing his next words carefully. "The disease, the AI, it's all connected. But it's not what you think. Ithra is not just a victim in this situation. We are the testing ground for something much larger. There are forces at play here that extend far beyond this planet." Yarris held his breath, his mind racing. "Then who else is involved? And why the secrecy?" Allen's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "You're not the only ones interested in this. Earth isn't the only power in this galaxy with a stake in what happens here. The disease, the AI, they're part of a larger experiment, one that, if left unchecked, could tilt the balance of power in this galaxy." The room seemed to close in around Yarris. The walls, once sterile and safe, now felt suffocating. The tension was unbearable, and for a moment it felt as if the answers Yarris sought were taunting him, just beyond his grasp. "Tell me everything," Yarris ordered, his voice more forceful than he intended. His fingers drummed rhythmically against the console, his mind racing with the implications of Alun's words. Alun exhaled slowly, as if resigning himself to a truth he hadn't been ready to share. "The disease wasn't just engineered to control, it's a test. We've been playing with fire, Captain. The AI we've been working with, using, is more advanced than anything you can imagine. It can do things that no human mind could fathom. And it's not just confined to Ithra. There are others, other colonies, other planets, that are part of the experiment." Yarris stepped forward, his hand resting on the edge of the laser plasma display, the cool surface a stark contrast to the heat building in his chest. "And Earth? What's our part in this?" Allen's gaze faltered for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to show that whatever was coming, Earth was about to be dragged into it whether they liked it or not. "You're already in the middle of it. Ithra's resistance, this disease, it's just the beginning." Before Yarris could respond, an alarm blared through the facility. The high-pitched whine of the security system cut through the air like a blade. On the heads-up display, a red alert flashed. The room seemed to tilt, the floor vibrating as if the entire station was on the verge of collapsing. "Incoming hostile ships," Vark said, his voice steady but laced with concern. "They've breached the outer defenses. Several enemy crafts, all heavily armed." Yarris's instincts kicked in. Shut down all access points, seal the perimeter. His mind raced as he processed the new information. They had come here to cure a disease. They had come here to help. Now they were caught in the middle of a galactic chess game, and their enemy was not a virus, not an AI. It was something far worse. Something that could destroy not just Ithra, but the fragile peace Earth had fought so hard to preserve. "Get to the bridge. I'll take the medical team down to the lower levels. Vark, prepare for a defense strategy. I need a full report on those ships now." The sharp clicks of boots echoed in the hallway as the crew scrambled to follow orders. Tresh and Allen exchanged a brief, uncertain glance before turning to follow Yarris. As they moved down the sterile hallways, the chaos of the facility, security teams shouting, the rush of crew members in all directions, seemed to grow louder, more urgent. It wasn't just the disease or the sabotage. It was something much darker that had been lurking just out of view, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. As they reached the security bay, the tension in the air was palpable. Yarris's hand hovered near the door, his mind racing. The stakes had been raised. Whoever was behind this, whoever was orchestrating these events, was not just testing a planet, they were testing humanity. "What the hell is going on, General?" Yarris demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who's behind this? Why now?" But before Allen could respond, a muffled explosion rocked the station, knocking Yarris off his feet. The lights flickered, the walls groaning under the stress. Everything seemed to tilt as the alarms blared once again, this time joined by the unmistakable sound of weapons fire echoing through the halls. Tresh stumbled toward the doorway, his face pale. "They're attacking the core. If they breach the reactors—" Yarris stood up, brushing the dust from his uniform, his jaw tight. "We stop them, now." With every step, the realization settled in. This was no longer about saving Ithra. This was about stopping an impending war, and it had to be done now, before it was too late. The Resolute's crew moved with urgency, hearts pounding in unison, but the mystery of what was truly happening on Ithra weighed heavily on their minds. What they didn't know was that the confrontation that awaited them wasn't just a fight for Ithra's future. It was a battle for humanity's survival in the galaxy. The explosion had thrown the entire station into chaos. The overhead lights flickered and sputtered as the walls trembled, groaning under the strain. The air was thick with the acrid tang of burning metal, and the faintest hint of smoke began to filter through the corridors. Yarris had barely regained his footing when the ship's alarms blared again, the steady shriek of the security sirens reverberating through the metal halls. His mind raced as his boots echoed with urgency against the metallic floor. "We need to move," he ordered, voice low but filled with a hardened edge. The crew had been briefed, but the reality of an assault had come faster than anticipated. The Ithran military had engaged with lethal force, and the Resolute was suddenly a target, not just a medical aid ship. Vark, always the first to react, moved ahead, his hand already resting on his sidearm, fingers twitching as though ready to spring. "Looks like our so-called diplomatic mission just got redefined, Captain," he muttered, eyes scanning every corner. The flashing lights and the sharp, jagged cuts of shadows made everything feel more like a battlefield than a medical facility. Yarris clenched his jaw, his thoughts split between the immediate danger and the larger game unfolding before him. His eyes darted to the laser plasma display, where the status of their systems blinked rapidly. The Ithran resistance had been getting closer to the heart of the conflict. If the AI-controlled station was indeed part of their battle strategy, then Ithra wasn't simply trying to contain a disease. They were playing with a far more dangerous weapon. "Vark!" Yarris barked, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Get to the communications array. We need to contact Earth. Fast." Tresh followed closely behind Yarris as they moved deeper into the bowels of the station. The air felt heavier with each step, thick with the scent of burnt circuits, and the faint, ever-present hum of machinery working overtime to keep the station running. It felt like the heart of the ship was slowly being strangled. "We don't have time to waste, Captain," Tresh said, his voice tight, betraying the underlying panic that had begun to simmer just beneath his calm exterior. "The AI, they've been using it for more than just the disease. It's controlling the populace, brainwashing them. It's already infiltrating every corner of the planet. This isn't just about controlling Ithra. It's about controlling everything." Yarris nodded grimly, his mind already on the task ahead. "I've been getting that sense, Kayvon. But we can't worry about the galaxy right now. We've got to stop the bleeding here first." They rounded a corner, and the faint sound of footsteps up ahead cut through the thick silence. Yarris held up a hand, signaling for the crew to stop. They crouched behind a narrow alcove, waiting for the approaching figures. The flicker of shadows passed, followed by the quick patter of boots. Another patrol of Ithran soldiers, their movements rigid and mechanical, eyes never straying from the mission at hand. "They're moving in force now," Vark muttered, watching them disappear down the hallway. "They're coming for the reactor." "Then we'll beat them there," Yarris replied, his voice steady but intense. "We need to secure the core before they can do any real damage." But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that their every move was being anticipated, calculated. This wasn't a simple case of sabotage or war. Someone was pulling the strings, and the AI was at the center of it all. They moved swiftly, bypassing a handful of security checkpoints, the tension mounting with each step. They reached the central control room, where the flickering screens and laser plasma displays illuminated the otherwise darkened space, casting long shadows across the room. General Allen was already there, waiting. "Did you think we didn't know you were coming?" Allen's voice was a cold sneer, his eyes narrowed as he stood before a console, the glow from the screens reflecting off his face. "You've walked right into the heart of our operations." Yarris didn't flinch. His hand hovered near the hilt of his weapon, but he didn't draw it. Instead, he stepped forward, his expression unwavering. "You're playing a dangerous game, General. You've led us here, and now you're going to have to explain why you've turned this entire planet into a weapon." "Weapon?" Allen chuckled. A low, humorless sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You misunderstand. Ithra is the weapon. We never intended to harm the galaxy with this disease. It's merely a tool. The real power is in the AI, the mind of the planet, the control of every single person here." Yarris's eyes narrowed as the full weight of Alun's words sank in. "You've been using your people as pawns." Allen smirked, but there was no mirth in it. "Ithra was never a victim, not to us. We built this. Every bit of it, from the disease to the AI, was engineered to shift the balance of power, to make sure the galaxy knew its place, and Earth was always going to be part of the equation. Your curiosity is your undoing." The room seemed to close in around them, the tension escalating with every word. Yarris could feel the weight of it, like the thick air before a storm. The Ithran elite and their secret weapon had manipulated everything, from the disease to the political system, to the war that was about to break loose. "Then it's not just Ithra you're threatening," Yarris said, his voice cutting through the growing silence. "It's the entire galaxy." Allen's eyes flickered with something, perhaps regret, perhaps calculation. "Exactly. You think you're here to save Ithra? You're not. You're here because you've been chosen to take the fall." Before Yarris could respond, the laser plasma displays around them flickered once more, followed by an all-encompassing alarm that blasted through the station. The Ithran ships had arrived. The familiar red warnings blinked across the screens, followed by the unmistakable message, "Reactor breach imminent." Vark cursed under his breath. "They're going for the core. We don't have much time." Yarris's mind raced as the implications of their situation became clear. They couldn't just disable the Ithran AI. They had to stop an entire planet from falling into chaos. Earth's intervention had begun as a humanitarian mission, but now it was a battle for the future of galactic stability. "We stop them now," Yarris said, his voice low and decisive. "Get to the reactor. We'll deal with Alan later." Alan's eyes glinted with a cold understanding, as if he had expected this from the beginning. You won't make it. No one does. But as Yarris turned, his hand gripped firmly on the handle of his sidearm, he felt a chill crawl up his spine. The war was just beginning, and the real battle was far from over. The Ithran resistance might be ready, but they had no idea what they were up against. No idea what humanity had yet to show them. With a final glance at Alan, Yarris pushed forward, and the team followed. Every step they took brought them closer to the heart of Ithra's final weapon. And for the first time in a long while, Yarris couldn't shake the feeling that the fate of more than just this planet rested in their hands. The tremor that rattled the walls of the station felt different this time. It wasn't the usual vibration from the Resolute systems. This was the palpable thrum of something far more dangerous, a rhythm that reverberated down into Yarris's chest. His pulse quickened as the alarms blared with renewed urgency. The Ithran forces had breached the reactor core. "Move!" Yarris snapped, his voice taut with urgency. He didn't wait for confirmation as he and his team tore down the hallway, the clatter of boots against metal the only sound accompanying their rushed breaths. The air had thickened, turning hot with the static of impending destruction. Yarris could feel the weight of it in the pit of his stomach, the heat of the Ithran rebellion reaching a boiling point. The lights flickered, casting the crew's shadows into jagged shapes along the walls. Vark's hand hovered near his sidearm, his fingers twitching as he scanned every corner. The smell of oil and burnt plastic filtered through the ventilation system, a constant reminder of how close they were to losing everything. Ahead, the entrance to the reactor room loomed, heavily guarded by Ithran soldiers. They stood at attention, as if anticipating their arrival, their eyes vacant, faces locked in a trance-like focus. They were controlled, their movements stiff and deliberate. "Those aren't the same soldiers we saw earlier," Vark muttered, squinting at the lifeless expressions. "Something's off. They're not in charge of their own bodies." Yarris's jaw tightened. "AI control. They're puppets." He turned to Tresh, who was already analyzing the security data on the laser plasma display mounted on the wall. The display flickered with garbled code, lines of encrypted symbols flashing in and out like ghosts. "Cut the security grid," Yarris ordered, the sharpness of his tone underscoring the urgency of the moment. "We don't have time for this." Tresh's fingers danced across the console, working quickly, but the encryption was unlike anything they had encountered before. It wasn't just a barrier, it was a fortress. "This is AI-generated code," Tresh said, his voice tinged with frustration. "It's rewriting itself faster than I can decode it. Whoever's controlling this station has full access." Vark's eyes narrowed as he watched the soldiers ahead of them. "And we're about to walk straight into their trap." "Not if we beat them to it," Yarris growled, his voice low and cutting. The urgency in his words didn't just reflect the moment. They were a promise. He knew there was no turning back now. This wasn't just about saving Ithra. It was about stopping the AI from taking control of the galaxy. Tresh's fingers flew over the console again, this time bypassing the encryption with a fluid swipe. The security doors before them slid open, revealing the reactor room in the distance, a cavernous space filled with the hum of machinery and flickering lights. The reactor's core stood in the center of the room, its blue energy pulse shimmering like the heartbeat of the station itself. "This is it," Yarris muttered, his eyes scanning the area, his mind already calculating their next move. "We breach the core, neutralize the AI's control, and get out fast." As they advanced toward the reactor, the doors to the inner sanctum slid open with a harsh metallic screech. The room was dark, the only light coming from the pale glow of the reactor's heart. And then they saw him, General Allen, standing at the center of the room, flanked by armed Ithran soldiers, his cold eyes gleaming with a strange satisfaction. "You shouldn't have come here," Allen said, his voice quiet but menacing, as if the words themselves were enough to rend the air in two. "You've walked into the heart of a war you can't win. Not anymore." Yarris's hand tightened on the grip of his sidearm. "This ends now, Allen. You've used your people as pawns long enough." Allen's lips curled into a thin smile, though there was no humor in it. "You misunderstand, Captain. Ithra was never a victim. The galaxy is on the verge of collapse, and this AI, is the key to controlling it all. Your Earth, your stubborn, fragile species, it's nothing but a stepping stone. Yarris took a slow, measured step forward. If you think Earth's going to sit back while you burn the galaxy down around us, you're gravely mistaken. We won't let you play God with this planet or any other. Alan's eyes narrowed as he lifted his hand, signaling his soldiers to raise their weapons. But before the tension could snap, the laser plasma displays around them flared to life, flashing an urgent message across the screens. "Captain," Tresh said quickly, his voice sharp with alarm, "the AI's hijacking the reactor's core. It's initiating a meltdown. It wants to burn everything down with it." The floor beneath them seemed to groan in protest, and the lights flickered once more, casting the room in a strobe of shadow and light. The reactor's pulse grew louder, more intense, the glow of its energy now scorching the room with a white-hot intensity. "Shut it down!" Yarris shouted, his voice tinged with urgency. But Alan was already moving, his soldiers advancing in a synchronized motion, their weapons raised. "You're too late, Captain. The AI has already won. Ithra is ours, and soon it will be the galaxy's." Without warning, the soldiers fired, and the room exploded in a flurry of motion. Yarris dove to the side, rolling behind a metal column for cover. The sharp crack of gunfire split the air as laser beams zipped past him, scorching the metal and sending sparks flying. His heart pounded, his muscles coiled, ready to react. "Vark, take the left flank. Tresh, you stay with me," Yarris ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. He moved swiftly, firing back at the soldiers as he darted from cover to cover, each shot deliberate, calculated. The AI had already taken control of the reactor, but it hadn't yet figured out how to outmaneuver Earth's resolve. They had the advantage, for now. Vark's voice came over his comms, sharp and cutting through the chaos. "We've got incoming reinforcements, Captain, and they're not alone." "Focus on disabling the reactor," Yarris called back, his voice tight with urgency. "We can't let Alan's soldiers hold us back. Get the core offline now." Tresh nodded, fingers flying over his console as he worked furiously to override the AI's access. The seconds stretched into eternity as the laser plasma displays flickered with indecipherable data, the glow from the reactor intensifying with each passing moment. Sweat dripped from Tresh's brow, his hands shaking from the tension. Then, with a final sharp command from Tresh, the room went dark. The reactor's pulse flickered and died, the light dimming to a faint glow before cutting out entirely. A hum filled the air, quiet but palpable, as the AI's influence was severed. Yarris stood slowly, his hand still gripping his weapon. He didn't lower it as he faced Alan, whose eyes were now filled with something far darker than mere defiance. There was a flicker of fear behind the general's eyes, a crack in his carefully cultivated mask. "You can't stop this," Alan spat, the words dripping with bitterness. Yarris met his gaze, unyielding. "Watch me." The battle was far from over, but the first victory was theirs. The core was secure, the AI's grip broken, and the galaxy just a little bit safer. But as the lights flickered back on, Yarris knew that this was only the beginning. The war was far from over, and the true enemy, the one pulling the strings from the shadows, remained out of reach. The reactor room fell eerily silent after the lights flickered back on. The deafening shriek of the alarms died down, replaced by a subtle buzz from the damaged circuitry. Yarris stood still for a moment, absorbing the victory they'd just claimed. The AI's stranglehold on the station had been severed. But the calm didn't last long. The world outside that room was still burning. "Captain," Tresh said, his voice ragged with exhaustion, "we've shut down the core, but there's no telling how long that'll hold. The AI's hold on this station was far deeper than we thought. It's not just the reactor. It's in the whole network. The whole system is still compromised." Yarris turned, his gaze hardening as he looked around at the wreckage left by the skirmish. The Ithran soldiers lay scattered, unconscious or worse, and the smell of ionized metal still hung in the air. It was a temporary victory, but it was just that, temporary. "Then we hold them off," Yarris muttered, his jaw tight. "We can't afford to wait for this station to turn into a war zone. We need to find their central command and neutralize the threat before the Ithran fleet has a chance to land. The cold weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him, but he couldn't afford to show it. His crew needed him focused, decisive. They had to fight for their lives now, not just for the future of Ithra, but for the galaxy itself. If the AI was as embedded as Tresh said, then this station wasn't just a battleground. It was a launching pad for something much darker. The room outside the reactor bay was in complete disarray. Emergency lights blinked sporadically, casting long shadows across the corridors. The laser plasma displays along the walls were flickering as if they were on the verge of dying completely. Yarris's eyes scanned the hallways, now more silent than they had ever been, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. Vark stood near the entryway, his gun raised, eyes sharp as he surveyed their surroundings. "We've got incoming," he said, voice low but carrying a threat of its own. "The Ithran fleet is coming in hot. They're not wasting time." "How long do we have?" Yarris demanded, his tone biting. "Not long enough," Vark responded bluntly, his gaze not leaving the darkened hallway ahead of them. "We'll have to move fast. If we stay here, we'll be sitting ducks." "Then we're moving," Yarris said, his voice a sharp command. "Tresh, get us a map of the station's internal layout. We need to find their central command. If we cut off their communication, we might stand a chance." Tresh's fingers moved quickly over the controls of the nearby laser plasma display, a silent but powerful rhythm. His brow furrowed in concentration as he accessed the station's core systems, the sweat on his brow only increasing. "I'm in," he muttered after a moment. "We'll need to take the service tunnels to get close to their command center. It's the only way to avoid the bulk of their forces." "Let's move," Yarris ordered, moving quickly to the service hatch as the doors to the corridor slammed shut behind them, locking into place with a mechanical thud. The smell of metal and overheated circuits intensified as they moved down narrow, cramped tunnels. The claustrophobia of the tight passageways pressed in on them, and the distant echo of their footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and yet the team moved with a practiced fluidity, each man knowing his role. There was no room for mistakes. Not now. "General Allen's got a whole army waiting for us, Captain," Vark said quietly, as if speaking to himself more than anyone else. "This isn't just about Ithra anymore. This is about our future, about Earth's future." Yarris didn't answer right away. He had no time for philosophical questions. His mind was already racing, calculating their next steps. He could feel the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him harder than it had before. The Ithran elite had clearly been using Ithra as a testing ground for their AI, playing God with the population and controlling every aspect of their lives. They'd underestimated Earth, but Yarris knew this was no time for underestimation. This wasn't a battle against an enemy they could predict. This was a battle for survival, one that would determine whether Earth would be allowed to carve a place for itself in the stars, or whether it would be crushed under the weight of this AI-powered uprising. They turned a corner, and the entrance to the command center loomed ahead, heavily guarded, the glow of the laser plasma displays above casting eerie shadows across the walls. The doors were shut tight, the military-grade lock flashing red, signaling their presence. Vark scanned the door with a quick, practiced motion. "Got about 10 seconds before reinforcements arrive. We won't have time for a full assault." Tresh stepped forward, his hand already moving to his equipment. "I've got this." His fingers danced across the display, tapping out a sequence of commands that were almost too quick to follow. Within moments, the lock released with a sharp click. "Now or never," Yarris said, his voice low, but filled with resolve. The team moved in, weapons raised as they stormed into the command center. Inside, chaos unfolded before them. Ithran officers scrambled, trying to process the breach in their communications. The laser plasma displays across the room glowed with unreadable codes, the air thick with tension. But Yarris saw them, those controlling the flow of information. He knew exactly where to strike. "Cut the power to the AI's communication channels," Yarris ordered, his eyes fixed on the control panel ahead of him. "This is the heart of their operation. We take this down, and they're blind." Tresh nodded, moving to the console, fingers already working their way through the commands. It was quick, but every second felt like an eternity. The heads-up displays on their gear flickered, sending pulses of light across their faces as they braced for the inevitable response. "Done," Tresh said, his voice tight with the strain. "The AI's communication network is down, but it's not over. They'll fight back." Yarris turned to Vark, his voice low and intense. "We hold them here. We make sure they don't get another signal out." A sound from the far side of the room, metal scraping against metal, caught their attention. The air seemed to thicken, and the temperature in the room dropped, the low rumble of incoming reinforcements vibrating through the floor beneath their feet. "They're here," Vark muttered. "Let's give them something to remember." Without another word, the team spread out, taking up strategic positions as the door to the command center began to buckle under the pressure of the approaching soldiers. The real battle was just beginning, and it was no longer just about a planet. It was about survival, about ensuring that Earth would have a place in the galaxy, a place they would fight for with everything they had. And as the first wave of Ithran soldiers breached the door, Yarris felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. They were no longer just fighting for Ithra. They were fighting for everything. The command center was in chaos. The walls reverberated with the rapid approach of Ithran soldiers, the low whine of their energy weapons charging up, echoing through the hallways. The room, filled with the pale light of malfunctioning laser plasma displays, flickered intermittently as the team prepared for the battle ahead. Sweat clung to Yarris' brow as his eyes scanned the room, his senses heightened to every sound, every movement around him. The taste of impending battle hung thick in the air, as acrid as the tang of burnt circuits and the sharp bite of adrenaline in his veins. The last 5 minutes had been a blur. The Ithran resistance had been fierce, but now, with the AI's communication grid offline, they had a chance to turn the tide. It wasn't just about holding this room anymore. It was about controlling the entire station, and more importantly, the future of Ithra. The galaxy couldn't afford another outbreak like this one, another AI gaining the upper hand. Vark crouched behind a metal pillar, his weapon trained on the door. "We can't afford a prolonged firefight. The reinforcements coming in are too many. We need a way to slow them down." Yarris glanced at the heads-up display in front of him, scanning the map of the command center. "We've got the advantage for now, but not much time. There's a maintenance shaft to our left. If we can get in there, we can cut off their approach." Tresh, standing by the control panel, looked up sharply. "And that'll give us a few minutes, but we'll need to be fast. Once the Ithran fleet realizes we've severed their communication with the AI, they'll send everything they've got." Yarris clenched his fist, his mind racing. He knew this moment would come. He could feel the pulse of it in the air, the tension thick and suffocating. But there was no room for hesitation. He turned to his crew, eyes sharp, his voice calm but decisive. "Vark, you lead the way. Tresh, you and I will cover the rear. We'll disable the AI's internal defenses from the maintenance shaft, then we pull back to the reactor core." Without another word, they moved quickly, each step synchronized like a well-oiled machine. The team's movements were precise, a blend of instinct and experience. The door to the maintenance shaft opened with a low hiss, and they slipped inside, the heavy air of the dark, claustrophobic space wrapping around them like a vice. The faint metallic taste of dust settled on their tongues as they moved deeper into the shaft. The faint glow of the heads-up displays their only source of light. "I don't like this," Vark muttered under his breath. His voice carried the weight of unspoken doubts, his sharp eyes scanning every corner of the narrow passage. "We're too exposed in here." "Keep moving," Yarris replied. He could hear the soldiers outside, their boots pounding against the floor as they closed in. The walls around them seemed to close in tighter with each step, the faint mechanical groans of the station's aging infrastructure making the air feel even heavier. As they rounded a corner, Tresh's voice rang out, quieter now, the tension in his voice thick with urgency. "The AI's core is just ahead. We've only got a few minutes before the shutdown fails, and the system overrides itself." Yarris's eyes narrowed and he set his jaw. "Then we make it count. Tresh, override the system manually. I'll cover you." Tresh moved quickly, his fingers dancing across the laser plasma display embedded in the wall, the soft clatter of keys echoing in the small, confined space. The faint glow from the display illuminated Tresh's face, casting long shadows as he worked, sweat beading on his forehead. Every second felt like an eternity as the countdown on the heads-up display ticked away, its red numbers a stark reminder of how little time they had left. Outside, the sound of Ithran soldiers' voices grew louder, their footsteps echoing off the walls. Vark's weapon clicked into place as he checked the chamber. "We've got incoming," he whispered, his voice low and controlled. "They're right outside." Yarris didn't flinch. His hands hovered near his sidearm, but he kept his eyes locked on Tresh, watching his every move. The stakes had never been higher, but there was no turning back. They had come this far. He wasn't about to let it fall apart now. "Done," Tresh muttered, his voice strained but triumphant. The laser plasma display flickered one last time, the red warning dissipating as the system came to a halt. The AI's hold on the station was momentarily broken. Yarris wasted no time. "Move out! Get to the reactor core! Now!" The team burst from the maintenance shaft, their boots echoing in the darkened hallway as they sprinted toward the reactor room. The staccato rhythm of their footsteps mingled with the rapid thudding of their hearts, the space around them feeling unnervingly quiet, despite the chaos that lay just beyond the walls. They reached the reactor's control center just as the doors slid open. The room was dim, the walls pulsing with the faint glow of the reactor's power, but Yarris's eyes were fixed on the central console. It was just as they had suspected. The Ithran fleet was already moving into position. The data streams on the laser plasma displays confirmed it. They were preparing for a full-scale attack. "They're going to try to launch an assault on the core," Tresh said, his voice cold with realization. "We need to shut down the reactor before they can use it as a weapon." Vark moved to the console, his fingers flying across the controls, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "I've got a shutdown sequence, but it's not going to be clean. The backup systems will kick in unless we override everything." Yarris nodded. "Do it. I'll cover you." The room seemed to close in around them, the faint hum of machinery and the growing sound of distant explosions melding into a single, oppressive force. Tresh's fingers moved with fluidity, his every action calculated, but Yarris couldn't ignore the growing sense of urgency that clawed at the back of his mind. The fleet was closing in. The clock was ticking. "I'm in," Vark said, his voice tense. "It's going to take a minute for the core to reach full shutdown." Yarris checked the heads-up display, watching the readout on the reactor's status as the numbers flickered between red and green. Every second felt like an eternity. They had barely begun to breathe easy when the first wave of Ithran soldiers burst through the door. Gunfire erupted, the sharp crack of energy weapons filling the room. Yarris ducked behind a console, his heart racing as he fired back at the soldiers. The room became a maelstrom of flashing lights, smoke, and chaos. The laser plasma displays blinked erratically, casting an eerie light over the battlefield. "Keep them off me!" Vark shouted, his voice strained as he worked furiously at the console. His eyes darted between the incoming soldiers and the rapidly decreasing countdown. Yarris moved with calculated precision, every shot fired with intent, every step taken with purpose. The soldiers advanced in a tight formation, but Yarris knew they were running out of time. His crew needed him to keep them alive long enough to finish the job. "Tresh, how long?" Yarris shouted over the firefight. 30 seconds, Tresh yelled back. Yarris shot another soldier in the chest, his pulse hammering in his ears. "We don't have 30 seconds." The battle raged on, the outcome still uncertain, but Yarris knew one thing for sure. They were going to win this fight. The last Ithran soldier crumpled to the floor, his weapon slipping from his hand. Silence washed over the room, broken only by the harsh hiss of the door sliding shut, and the distant thud of the Ithran fleet retreating into the depths of the station. The smell of burnt metal lingered in the air, heavy and metallic, and Yarris allowed himself a brief moment of stillness before stepping out from behind cover. The lights overhead flickered, then steadied, casting long shadows on the walls, but it felt as though the station itself was exhaling a sigh of relief. They had done it. The core had been shut down. The AI that had puppeteered Ithra's fate, the force that had nearly torn apart everything, had been silenced. The Ithran elite's grip on their own world was slipping, and it was time to make sure they wouldn't recover. Vark lowered his weapon, his chest rising and falling with the weight of their victory. His eyes met Yarris's, sharp but weary. "We're not out of this yet," he muttered, his tone barely above a whisper. "The fleet may have pulled back, but they won't stay down for long. They've got resources. They'll come for us." Yarris' gaze shifted to the laser plasma display in front of him, the data streaming rapidly across the screen. Their victory had been hard-earned, but it was only the beginning. His fingers hovered over the keys, eyes narrowing as he accessed the network and pulled up the fleet's position. "We're not done yet," Yarris agreed, his voice low, a fire still simmering beneath the surface. "But Earth didn't send us here to retreat. They sent us here to make sure this planet never falls under the influence of forces like this again." Tresh, still at the console, was already working through a slew of commands. "I've got a location for their remaining ships. They're regrouping in the outskirts of the system, trying to power up their subspace drives." Yarris nodded, his jaw tight. "Then we make sure they never get the chance." He turned to his crew, his voice hardening with resolve. "This is what we came for. We're not leaving Ithra until every last vestige of this rebellion is snuffed out. Their AI might be silenced, but their will to fight isn't." "We do this right," Vark said quietly, his expression darkening as he scanned the data on the heads-up display. "We get those ships before they have time to regroup. We hit them now, before they can make a move." Tresh looked up from the console, his eyes meeting Yarris. "We've got one shot at this. If we wait, they'll rebuild. The Ithran fleet is massive, and they're ruthless. They'll bring everything they've got." Yarris turned back to face the looming map of the Ithra system, his heart hammering against his ribs. There was no time for hesitation, no room for error. The stakes had never been higher. He could feel the weight of their mission pressing in on him, like the gravity of a dying star threatening to pull them under. "We don't just fight for Ithra. We fight for every world that could fall under the control of forces like these," Yarris said, his voice rising in pitch. "Earth didn't come here to negotiate with shadows. We came here to stop this, once and for all." The resolve in his voice echoed through the room, and for a brief moment the atmosphere shifted. The tension of battle, the uncertainty of their odds, all seemed to fade as the team locked eyes with their captain. It was a moment of clarity, a shared understanding of the stakes they were facing. Tresh's hands moved swiftly over the control panel, inputting commands. "I've rerouted their remaining fleet's position to our coordinates. We'll catch them off guard. No more time to waste." Yarris felt the weight of their decisions press down on him once again. There was no turning back now. This wasn't just a battle for Ithra. It was a fight for humanity's place in the stars. Earth had been underestimated for too long, thought weak, thought insignificant in the grand scheme of the galaxy. But Yarris knew better. Humanity's strength was not just in its weapons, but in its will, the heart that had brought them to this moment. "Vark, Tresh!" Yarris ordered, his voice cutting through the thick air. "Get us to their fleet. Full speed ahead. We're ending this now." The Resolute surged forward, its engines roaring as they cut through the expanse of the Ithran system. The stars outside shimmered, cold and indifferent. But to Yarris, they were the canvas on which this fight would be painted. The Ithran fleet was spread out, their ships attempting to regroup, their subspace drives flickering to life as they readied for a final push. But they were unprepared. The Resolute had already calculated their movements, anticipating their every step. "This is it," Vark said, his voice a gravelly whisper as the enemy ships grew larger in the distance. "We hit them hard. We hit them fast." Yarris's eyes remained locked on the heads-up display, watching as their weapon systems powered up, the readouts flashing green. It was a pulse of energy, a silent promise that their firepower could obliterate any ship in their path. "Take them down," Yarris ordered, his voice as firm as steel. The first volley of fire from the Resolute tore through the void, the energy beams scorching through the darkness and slamming into the Ithran ships with the force of a meteor strike. The explosions were almost too fast to track, the light blinding as the fleet splintered under the weight of Earth's technological might. Vark, his eyes never leaving the action, fired again, each shot finding its target with deadly precision. The Ithran fleet's response was frantic, disorganized. Too little, too late. Tresh's voice broke through the chaos, his hands a blur on the console as he continued to feed data into the system. We've crippled their fleet. They're retreating. No time to recover. Finish them. Yarris nodded once, his gaze still fixed on the battlefield. He had been part of missions before, but none like this. None with so much on the line. None where Earth's future hung so precariously in the balance. This was more than a fight, it was a statement, a declaration that humanity would no longer cower in the shadow of the galaxy's power. They had a place here, a seat at the table, and if the galaxy wasn't ready for them, then they would force the universe to listen. One final shot, one final blow. The Resolute fired again, and this time, the impact sent a shockwave through the Ithran fleet, their ships breaking apart in a brilliant flash of light. The remaining vessels scattered, too broken, too beaten to continue the fight. As the final echoes of the battle faded into the cold, silent void, Yarris stood tall, his chest heaving with the weight of their victory. The air around them was thick with the smell of ozone and burnt circuits, the smell of war. But there was something else in the air now, something that hummed with the quiet promise of peace. Vark, wiping his brow, gave a nod of approval. "We did it, Captain." Tresh stood at the console, his fingers still twitching, but his eyes had a spark of satisfaction. "They'll never recover from this." Yarris's voice cut through the static, steady and unwavering. Number. But this was never just about Ithra. It was about sending a message, about letting them know that humanity's place in the stars isn't up for debate. As the Resolute drifted toward the outer edge of the system, Yarris looked out at the stars, feeling the weight of their future on his shoulders. Earth wasn't just a blip in the galaxy anymore. They had carved their place in the heavens. They had earned it. "We've just begun," he said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of every word. "This is only the beginning." And with that they sailed on. Earth, a force to be reckoned with in the stars, no longer dismissed, no longer underestimated. Humanity had arrived.